These singers swing hard. Their rhythms make you float across the floor as if your feet had wings. Their ballads make you want to fall in love again or mourn a love you lost years ago. Sometimes they'll even throw in a Latin tune or two. With their easily identifiable style, they're simply unforgettable. Who are they? Jazz singers. Hey, welcome to the Monique on the Mic podcast. I'm your host, Monique B. Thomas. This show is your go-to resource for professional and aspiring singers. Every Monday, join me for a mix of solo episodes and insightful interviews where I share real artist stories, practical strategies, and mindset shifts. Whether you're just starting out or are already on your journey, you'll find the tools you need to transform your vocal path and feel supported. I keep it real, I keep it fun, and it's always useful and up to date. Let's get into it. So I recently just wrapped up my second 5-day jazz vocal camp for this summer, and I just really had a good time, and the students did as well. It's very interesting because I never have a homogeneous group. In fact, I actually enjoy and prefer even teaching groups of people that have very different backgrounds, very different skill sets, and who just, they just don't have the same experiences in singing. So this year I had 2 dancers, I had a harpist, I had people that had vocal technique, I had people that never had vocal technique at all. And we all managed to, at the end of the camp, they all managed to do the same things, which is sing the songs in a style of jazz and also begin to put some of their own style on it. So let's talk about what we went through. I carefully planned out basic skills that all jazz singers need to know, like the differences between swing eighths and straight eighths, song structure, very basic jazz harmony, musical accents, performance practices, how to sing the blues, how to learn tunes, how to make a tune your own, counting off tunes for the band, and even how to play basic hand percussion. We worked on how to keep track of the tune during solos because that's where people tend to panic and get lost. What to do if you do get lost. And I realized that these are skills that I take for granted because I've been singing it for so long. But I noticed that if I could just get people to isolate these skills and practice them as slowly as they needed to be practiced, and that could be rather slowly, but regularly, and we just kept coming back to the skills so that we could build on them. So as soon as a skill was in place, then I would change the tempo. Or as soon as they understood something harmonically, I'd change the key and make sure that they could understand the same harmonic sequence in another key. And these are all things that I've always thought before it would take people years to learn these things. And actually, we did these things in 5 days by just repeating, but also doing it with a group. So over that 5-day period, there was a significant evolution in the students. I mean, in the very beginning, there was so much apprehension. All the voices were shaky and nobody wanted to volunteer to go first. There were a lot of unnecessary mistakes and some frustration because people just couldn't get their voices to cooperate and do the things. And it's simply because there was no trust. People didn't trust themselves to do a good job. And they didn't trust others in the fact that they'd be nice when mistakes were made. But by day 2, it had gotten a little bit better. I began to see people's personalities come through in their songs. But by day 5, everyone's uniqueness was showing through as well as the skills they had learned. So the takeaway is just how much progress can be made with a concentrated period of repetition. Now, I want to go through some of the myths that I typically hear as it pertains to jazz. The first one is, I don't have a voice for jazz. Meaning the type of voice that I have just possibly couldn't sing jazz. And this is the silliest thing I've ever heard, simply because there isn't one particular aesthetic that is jazz as far as the sound of the voice. You have voices like Sarah Vaughan, so a contralto, even slightly operatic sounding voice, but with an extremely large range. You've got a much higher instrument like Ella Fitzgerald. You have a more rough voice like a Nina Simone, and everything in between, high, low, smooth, sweet, everything. So there isn't just one aesthetic that makes a voice jazz. It's more about what you do with that voice. So you've got voices that are actually, they sound like they've been trained, and you've got other voices that are extremely limited. I mean, Louis Armstrong, affectionately known as Pops, had no vocal technique. And in fact, he wasn't really a singer, but he would often add into his shows some vocals to go along with his trumpet. And how charming is that, right? Here's what I think is interesting is that when non-singers tend to pick up, singing sort of to add something to the show, usually, even though the voice is not as polished, they get to the essence of what that music is, which is swing, which is rhythm, and then, of course, being personal about your interpretation. And so I think that this is something that often singers forget, is that they're looking to have this incredible voice immediately, which, to be honest with you, takes years as far as vocal technique. But you can always tell your story, even if you might be a little bit limited. The next myth I hear all the time is, I don't like jazz. I don't like jazz. And I'm like, really? You don't like jazz? And when I hear that, my immediate thought is, you don't like which jazz? You don't like jazz from 1900s, 1920, 30, 40, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. There's so many styles within jazz because jazz continually grew, it changed. So roughly every 10 years, what we heard as jazz was very, very different. In fact, there are different factions in jazz that are kind of like, they only like bebop, or they only like the swing period, or they only like the New Orleans period, or they only like hard bop. And so it lets you know that the aesthetics, the musical aesthetics change so greatly that some people might like one and not like another. Now, here's an interesting story. Many years ago, I had a voice student who was from the UK, and his name is Bill. So shout out to Bill if you're listening to this. But Bill came in, and Bill was more of he liked R&B. He liked R&B and soul singing. But I heard something in his voice and also his style. I'm like, you know, he's got a natural swing to him. And I'm thinking he would be great singing some jazz. So I gave him some Nat King Cole tunes. And he came back. He's like, I tried it. I just really don't like it. And I was a little surprised, but I thought, okay, let me think. I know that he likes soul and R&B. He likes things that are really bluesy and that have a gospel feel to it. So I thought, let me find a style of jazz that is the closest to that. And so that's hard bop. Hard bop is really, really very bluesy, gritty, gutsy kind of music, and it's closely related to the blues and to gospel. And so I started giving him tunes from that period, which is like 60s, 70s, 60s, giving him music in that era, and he loved it so much. And then once he got hooked on that, I was able to sort of bring him back a little further to the things I really originally wanted him to work on, and he began to love it. So it's often about finding what it is people like about music and then looking at the different eras of jazz that would have those elements in it. So when people tell me they don't like jazz, I'm thinking, you just don't know what to be listening to. That's just my opinion. The last thing that I hear, and I hear it often, and it kind of saddens me, is that jazz is too hard to understand. I like to remind people that jazz, it's just songs. It's just songs. A large majority of the songs we call standards and standard repertory, it just means that you go anywhere in the world and most jazz musicians are going to know the large majority of the same tunes. So we use that repertory over and over again. a lot of those songs come from what we call the Great American Songbook, and those are songs written by some great American composers like Gershwin, like Cole Porter, etc., like Duke Ellington, and um, some of them wrote for Broadway tunes, musical theater, and for Hollywood films. And then in the case of Duke Ellington, he was an adamant jazz musician, so his take on the music was a little bit different, but the structures were the same. So we have this music that jazz musicians adopted and would just turn into these masterpieces. But at the core, they're often songs that only have 32 measures to them. Not all, but a great majority of the repertoire only has 32 measures. And the structures are very easy to understand. Usually 8 measures, you've got one melody, and then the next 8 measures is often the same, and so we call that A. Now the next group of 8 measures is a different melody, and we usually call that the bridge. And then the last group of 8, if you're following me, 8 times 4 is 32. That last group of 8 is usually like the first, and we call that A, right? So that means you really only have to learn the first 8 and the third 8, which is A and B, and you know the song. So it's actually easy to understand when you understand strong song structure, which is what we did in the camp. But it saddens me that people think they can't understand it, because I think sometimes jazz musicians have an attitude of, I'm better than you because I'm doing this thing that you don't know. And that bothers me, because if we keep that attitude, then jazz will die and people won't get involved in it. But we got to remember, jazz, it wasn't about being intellectual, and it wasn't about being better than anybody else. It was originally about getting people to dance. It was dance music. So they didn't have DJs at that time. They had swing bands. They had big bands, 16 people or more on stage, and people were in the audience dancing. They weren't just sitting there. They were tapping their feet and they were moving around the floor at lightning speed. By the way, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you should check out Lindy Hop or Charleston or some other jazz styles of dancing. I do think that there are some styles of jazz, maybe more free styles of jazz or more fusion, where it might take a bit more knowledge of the music to appreciate it. But I think typically we probably have a good 40, 50 years of jazz that's actually rather easy to understand. And so if you're not sure, you should just maybe go through each 10 years and check out some different styles to understand it. Otherwise, you could always work with me and I'll make you understand it, because it's not that hard. Now I want to share something a little more personal with you, because I think it's interesting and it's related to all this jazz stuff, is that recently I have gotten involved in learning Lindy Hop, which is a jazz style of dancing. It's a swing style of dancing, and it was danced, with these big bands. And the reason I find this interesting is because, and again, this is very recent. When I say recent, I mean this last week I took 2 sort of, it wasn't a lesson, but it was kind of just an initiation where we just, different dancers showed me a few basic steps, and then there was social dance, so we were able to dance, and it was outside, and it was great. But here's what it informed me about learning and teaching how to sing jazz. The first thing is, the gold is in mastering the basics. There are basic steps in any dance. And so before you can, become suave and this, person that's just so light on their feet, you've got to master the basic steps, because they come back over and over and over again. Everything that you're going to do is going to be based on those basic steps and based on how well you can do them. And then the next thing you would do is speed those steps up. So you would work those steps at different tempos, the same way we do the basic skills in singing. That's exactly what we did with the students, is that we counted off at different tempos. We had them sing at different tempos. And so that would test how good their basics were. And of course, you get to a tempo where it becomes very difficult. And just so you know, it's not just fast tempos that are difficult. Very, very slow tempos are even more difficult. And then eventually, you've gone through all these different tempos, constantly testing your basic skills. Here's the other thing. So you test these things at different tempos, and then you test them with different partners. Much in the same way in singing, we're going to test our singing out with different musicians. Certain musicians rather, are going to be a bit more comfortable for you. And then others, you're going to actually have to listen a little harder or work a little harder to make music together. Same thing. What it really comes down to is practice, practice, practice. Making sure that every time you do that thing, whether it's singing or dancing, every single time you learn something even very small from that repetition of that song. Another thing that was very useful for me in this 1 week of dancing, because again, I'm not a dancer. I like dancing, and of course I know music, so that helps. But I'm not a dancer, which means I don't have as many hours of dancing as other dancers would have. But it's to stay lighthearted while you're learning. You've got to go at it with a sort of feeling of, it's not a big deal. I mean, you try, you fall, you get back up again, but it's not a big deal. And I noticed that whenever I would go into a dance thinking, oh, this is going to be fun, I danced much better. The basics, I was able to feel them and they just came out naturally on my feet. But as soon as I had any kind of apprehension about what I was going to do or what the other person was going to think of me, I instantly made, I would say, 80% more mistakes than I normally would make. So going about it in a lighthearted way, because me personally, rhythm has never been really a problem for me. I'm very good with rhythm. So I know in dancing that if I mess up the step, I can easily find the rhythm again. And so it's about getting your basics, but keeping a lightheartedness into where you make a mistake, but it's not really a big deal. And then that makes it more fun for everybody. If you're tense and intense, then the people either dancing with you or playing with you, accompanying you, they're going to feel it too. So stay lighthearted. Ooh, just one more thing about the basics. I noticed in dancing that as soon as I felt really comfortable with the basics, then it was a good time to start infusing just a little bit of style in it. Not so much so that I lost my grounding or my footing, literally, but just enough so that the person in front of me feels like I'm actually having a conversation with them rather than just going through the motions, because that's no fun for anybody. So that's the same thing with singing. As soon as you feel comfortable with what you're doing, you know what you're doing, then you've got to start infusing a little bit of your personality into it so that we don't just feel like this is sort of an autopilot thing. Because I think that's where singers get stuck, is they're immediately trying to make it perfect, 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 perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be relatively solid. And then because you're lighthearted, you know that if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal. So that's just a little bit of a recap of my 2 jazz camps that I had this summer. And I just want you to have a few things that you can think about. Is that, first of all, anyone can learn and sing jazz in a meaningful way because there's no one aesthetic. There is a tune or type of jazz for almost every type of music lover. And learning jazz is and should be fun. It should not be elitist. It's a team sport. It was meant to make people dance, and dancing feels good. So that means that jazz is fun. Oh yeah, and one last thing. When you're learning something new, so this is not just about jazz, it's about learning any new thing, especially when you've been on earth for, let's say, 20 or 30 years. Believe it or not, even though you're new to learning that particular subject, you're not completely starting at zero, because if you've learned anything else before, the act of learning is the same. It's get the basics, practice the basics. So it really is about how well you learn, how well you practice, how you deal with your ego, especially when your ego's feeling a little deflated because the thing is new and you're probably not as good as you want to be, which is absolutely normal when you're learning something. I think another thing that's a great takeaway is that, for example, the dancers that I had in the group, while they weren't used to singing, they were used to paying attention to the music. And so it was very easy for them to find their way in the songs. So then that meant there were other skills that they needed to learn, but they weren't starting from zero. And then I had the harpist who, she was kind of new to singing and also maybe new to playing jazz. She'd had a little bit of playing jazz, but singing was definitely new. But because she already played an instrument, she already knew a lot of the basic musical elements and a lot of the musical vocabulary. Then she just had to sort of transform that into singing, but also into more of a jazz realm. So just remember that usually, even though you're learning something new, you're not completely starting from zero, because you have skills that you've picked up along the way. And if you can identify what skills you already have that will help you to learn whatever it is you're trying to learn, I think you'll feel a little bit better about your journey. There you go. If you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're really liking what I'm throwing down, you'll love my Mike Masters newsletter. For more information on how to work with me and to sign up for the newsletter, visit www.moniquebthomas.com or check the show notes. Musically,